Thank you, Andrew, and happy birthday. Well, as I mentioned before, Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute is the principal sponsor of this conference. Dr. Elahe Omidyar Mirjalali, the founder and chair of the institute, was not able to join us. So she sent me a message, a letter that I'm very happy to read to you. It has a lot of information about what Roshan Institute does and how they help studies and research in this area. She writes, as the founder and chair of Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all participants to the second North American Conference in Iranian Linguistics, NASL 2, at the University of Arizona, which is the ideal site to host a conference specializing exclusively in languages of Iranian family, given the strength of its linguistics and Persian and Iranian studies programs. I commend Professor Simin Karimi at the U of A Department of Linguistics for leadership in organizing NASL 2 and continuing the great vision of Professor Richard Larson, former chair of the Department of Linguistics at Stony Brook University, who initiated this groundbreaking conference and successfully convened NASL 1 at Stony Brook University in April 2017. As a linguist myself, I am particularly proud that our institute is the principal sponsor of NASL 2 as it was for NASL 1. Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute was founded in 2000 to promote the preservation, transmission, and instruction of Persian language and culture in the United States and around the world. The Institute has provided grants and established numerous endowments at some of the most prestigious universities, including the University of Arizona, to support and expand Persian studies programs, faculty positions, and academic programming activities. Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute also partners with world-renowned cultural institutions to sponsor educational public programs relating to Persian arts and culture, such as conferences, exhibitions, performances, symposia, and community outreach events. In addition, we are proud to have helped nurture the next generation of Persian studies specialists through hundreds of Roshan Institute fellowships and scholarships for excellence in Persian studies for innovative research, publications, digitalization, translations, doctoral dissertations, and other scholarly activities. On behalf of Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, I wish to express our congratulations to Professor Simin Karimi for having attracted such notable scholars as participants and keynote speakers at NASL 2. It is a particular honor to count some of them among our extensive network of Roshan Institute Fellows. I deeply regret missing the opportunity to be among all of you, but wish everyone a successful and enjoyable conference filled with learning and excellent scholarly exchanges. On behalf of, and that was the letter, and now on behalf of NASL 2, I thank Dr. Mirjalali and the Roshan Institute for their generous contribution. Without the contribution, we couldn't have this conference, obviously. Now, at this time, finally, I would like to introduce my colleague, Massimo Piatelli Palmerini, to introduce our first distinguished keynote speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Simin, for inviting me to introduce Noam. Well, Simin asked me to introduce Noam, and I at first declined. Noam needs no introduction. She kindly insisted, so I had to acquiesce, and I'll do it my way, if you allow me, okay? So some of you may know that millions of years ago, I started as a physicist, and then much later, I became acquainted, and with Noam's work, and I found his approach to linguistics very congenial to a physicist. Bringing together by cogent further abstraction, previously, separate hypotheses, introducing inaudible elements, what we are called empty categories, something that has been fiercely criticized by the anti-generativists still to this day. But, you know, there is a quote that Noam likes and that I like from the Nobel physicist Jean Perrin, who said that the proper of science, le propre de la science, is to replace complex visibles with simple invisibles. This physics has been doing relentlessly, and Noam has been doing that too. Well, let me show you something. So these are the proceedings of a physics conference held in 2016 in the lovely, you know, seaside place of Castiglioncello, Italy. And it is, you know, the Journal of Physics, the top journal in physics. I'm showing you this because there is a paper by Noam in this. It's a talk that he gave at that conference in September 2016. Now, every 2 years, you know, they organize this conference, which is, you know, space-time matter quantum mechanics. And it is a tradition in the last day of the conference to invite scholars from other fields. In 2016, it was linguistics. So Noam has a paper here, which is entitled The Galilean Challenge, Architecture and Evolution of Language. I also have a paper here, but that's in essential. So he gave this talk, which was very well received by the physicists. You know, there were some friendly clarification questions. It was really, you know, very, very well received. Before his talk, there was another talk by an Austrian physicist that has a quote from Niels Bohr. It is a quote that I'm sure Noam will find very congenial. So the quote from Niels Bohr is the following: "It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature." You know, it's almost so. Let me tell you, you know, conclude a little anecdote. So over dinner that evening after Noam's talk, I was sitting next to a highly distinguished physicist, you know, William Bill Unruh, who bombarded me with questions about Noam's work. I did my best to answer the questions, friendly question. He's a big, very friendly guy, beard, big guy, famous physicist with a number of people. Now, let me tell you the following. He is the author of what is called the Unruh effect. What is the Unruh effect? You'll see in a moment why I'm telling you this. The Unruh effect is the following: a stationary observer looking at an accelerating body in the vacuum will see an increase in temperature due to acceleration. All physicists think it's right, you know, it's true. You know, the derivation, mathematical derivation of this principle by Bill Unruh is impeccable. So can you verify it experimentally? Well, not really, not in the real world, because look, in order to observe 1 Celsius degree of increase in temperature, you would have to accelerate that body 10 to the power 20 meters per second. You can't do that. So you understand that it was an easy task for me to persuade Bill Unruh of the solid status of empty categories, of silent, you know, case in a number of languages, of deleted copies. It was very easy for me to persuade him. So I really think, in a sense, that Noam is a virtual physicist. Please, Noam.
Okay, to close this computer.
Please. We're live streaming here.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
And want me to keep from covering the.
Oh, dear God, you can put your stuff on.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Always found technology a bother. Well, I'd also like to express my regret that we were prevented from having the interaction we anticipated with our Iranian colleagues. It's always painful to see governments interfering with academic freedom, particularly painful when it's our own. And this is not the first time with regard to Iran. I recall a couple of years ago there was the American Association for the Advancement of Science at its international conference in Boston, and there were many protests about the fact that Iranian scientists who had made very significant contributions to topics of great interest were prevented from attending. Painful to see this continuing. Well, turning to our topic, language can be studied in many different ways, as you all know. One crucial divide is between studying language as something internal to people, a trait of the person. So it's property of me that I'm talking English and not Farsi. It's a property of me that I have a shared capacity to of language, something that's a species property. That's one approach. It would be treating language something like the way we treat an individual visual system, for example. It's a property of the individual. Another approach is to regard language as something external to individuals, out there somewhere, not inside us. The first approach is expressed pretty well by great linguist Otto Jespersen about a century ago. He regarded the prime concern of linguistics to be to discover how, quoting him, how the elements of language come into existence in the mind of a speaker, an individual speaker, obviously on the basis of finite experience, yielding what he called a notion of structure in the mind that is definite enough to guide the speaker in framing sentences of his own, particularly free expressions. These are typically new to speaker and hearer. And then beyond that, a further concern had to discover the great principles that underlie the grammars of all languages. That's Jespersen a century ago. Adopting Jespersen's position, linguists are studying something in the mind of the speaker, both what is present as innate endowment and the mature state that's achieved, a study very similar to the investigation of other biological systems. Well, Jespersen was actually the last representative of a long tradition, a very rich tradition, which goes back to the origins of the scientific revolution in the 17th century. The scientific revolution began really when the thinkers of the day simply refused to accept what seemed natural and self-explanatory, whether it was the fall of bodies or the perception of a geometrical figure or anything else, and recognized that these phenomena were mysterious, puzzling, not self-explanatory at all, but demanding explanations. And one phenomenon that caught their attention, in fact, was language. That's the Galilean challenge that Massimo referred to. Galileo and his contemporaries expressed their awe and amazement at what is, in fact, is a remarkable phenomenon. The fact that with just a few sounds, symbols, it's possible to express an infinite number of thoughts, and also to somehow convey to others who have no access to our minds how our most inner thoughts are developing and what their nature is. Since I like the eloquence of their own words, I'll quote them. In their own words, they were awed by the method by which we are able to express our thoughts, the marvelous invention, we would now not call it an invention, the marvelous invention by which, using 25 or 30 sounds, we can create the infinite variety of expressions, which, having nothing in themselves in common with what is passing in our minds, nonetheless permit us to express all our secrets and allow us to understand what is not present to consciousness. In effect, everything we can conceive and the most diverse movements of our soul. And it is pretty amazing if you think about it. It seems natural, but give it some thought. I reckon something. Okay. Sorry. Try to avoid it. It is a remarkable fact in itself. Also, there's nothing comparable in the organic world. And
here's what I found.
That's Siri. I'm sorry, Professor. I'll just take it.
Somebody angry up there.
It's Siri. It's Apple is angry. Excellent. There we go.
Which
Just leave it.
okay.
Yours.
So the question is, how can this great achievement be understood and explained? Now, Galileo himself regarded the alphabet as the most stupendous of human inventions. First, because it enabled this achievement to be implemented and carried out, but also because the alphabet incorporated implicitly the wisdom of the ages and the answers to all possible questions, kind of like a universal Turing machine. Shortly after, the grammarians and logicians in Fort Weil Monastery expanded these notions, developed much of the foundations of contemporary logic and many insights into linguistics as well. They inaugurated what turned out to be quite a rich tradition of what was called universal and rational grammar. Universal because it was common to all human languages, rational because it was seeking explanations and not just descriptions. It was crucially seeking to, in Jesperson's terms, describe the great principles that underlie the grammars of all languages. Well, while the formulations were imprecise, I think it's fair to interpret this tradition as recognizing, at least implicitly, that the capacity for language, as well as individual languages, are actually internal properties of persons. It was also generally assumed, now we have much better evidence, but plausibly assumed at the time, that this capacity is shared through the species with no group differences and is unique to humans in fundamental respects. It's a true species property and the basis for human thought, human creativity, human culture. Well, this general program falls within the natural sciences. In recent years, borrowing Massimo's expression, it's been called the biolinguistics program. The early efforts to meet the Galilean challenge faced serious difficulties, both empirical and conceptual. Empirical difficulties, they just didn't have enough evidence, anything like it. Conceptual difficulty was that nobody had a real idea as to how to capture this notion of a concept of structure in the mind, which enables speakers to construct infinitely many free expressions capturing their thoughts. Well, all of this was swept aside by the structuralist behaviorist currents of the early 20th century. Jespersen himself was completely forgotten. It's an interesting review of the structuralist reaction or lack of reaction to Jespersen by Julia Falk, a historian of linguistics and language, about 20 years ago. But it was completely forgotten. The structuralist behavioralist approach adopted the second approach to the study of language, something external. You can see this very clearly if you simply look at the definitions of language that were given by leading figures. So, for example, for de Saussure, language was a kind of social contract. It what he called a collection of word images in the community of speakers. So something outside. For Leonard Bloomfield, the American linguist, language was the set of utterances that can be expressed in a speech community. For the leading philosophers of language, like W.E. Quine, language, in his words, is a fabric of sentences associated with one another with stimuli by the mechanism of conditioned response. Another leading philosopher of language, David Lewis, language is some infinite set of sentences. Both Quine and Lewis argued that it doesn't make any sense to think of a particular concept of structure that could determine, characterize this infinite set. It only makes sense to talk about the infinite set, the thing that's external to a person. Well, the tradition was totally forgotten, even people like Jespersen. Well, by the mid-20th century, it became possible to return to the tradition, which was unfortunately unknown, later rediscovered, and to express clearly what a concept of structure in the mind would be that permits the construction of an infinite number of expressions expressing our thoughts. That was the result of the work of great mathematicians, Alan Turing, Kurt Gödel, Emil Post, and others, who made very clear, developed what in fact is the modern theory of computability, and made it very clear what it means for a finite object to generate an infinite number of expressions. And that allows us to at least approach the Galilean challenge concretely for the first time. The structure of the concept of structure in mind is the internal language, nowadays sometimes called the I language. It's a finite generative system that generates an infinite array of structured expressions, each of which is interpreted as a thought, which can be externalized in some sensory motor modality, typically sound, but as we know, not necessarily so. This property we could call the basic property of language. And then to meet the Galilean challenge, once this concept is clarified, there are a series of tasks. One of them, of course, is simply to try to describe accurately the variety of I languages, not a slight task. Second problem is to explain how the speaker can select a particular instance of the infinite set of expressions in the mind when speaking and interacting. Another question is how this selected expression is externalized. typically in sound. Third, how the expression is processed and interpreted by a speaker, mapping the sound to an internal expression. Well, of these topics, the second and the third, externalizing the selected expression and interpreting it, both of these are input-output processes, the kind that we sort of know how to grasp. And there's been a lot of progress in discovering what kinds of operations are involved in externalizing the internal expression processing what's heard. The first of these tasks, how a speaker selects a particular expression, that remains a total mystery. There's nothing to say about it. That's part of property of voluntary action generally, which is, for whatever reason, beyond at least contemporary human capacity to grasp. The problem was described rather well by one of the leading, maybe the leading scientist who studies voluntary action, Emilio Pizzi, and his colleague Robert Ajamian, in a review of the state of the art recently. They pointed out, as they put it fancifully, that we're beginning to understand the puppet and the strings, but we have absolutely nothing to say about the puppeteer. In our case, how the selection takes place. So that we put aside as one of several crucial mysteries that are part of the Galilean challenge. Well, the I language is a property of the individual, so is the species-specific faculty of language, UG in our lingo, the faculty that enables the I language to be acquired. And the study of the faculty of language of UG faces two crucial empirical conditions, which are immediate if one adopts this approach to the study of language. The one is the problem of learnability. How can the I language be acquired? The other is the problem of evolvability. How could the faculty of language have somehow emerged in the mind? Serious questions. Now, it's important. These are the questions of rational and universal grammar, reinterpreted in our terms. It should be recognized that all of an approach of this kind to language imposes very austere conditions on what counts as a genuine explanation. We will have a genuine explanation of some phenomena of language if we provide an account of how any device that's used to describe it can have been learned and how it can have evolved. Short of that, we don't have an explanation. We just have an organization of data, which is very valuable. It's very useful to have an organized account of phenomena rather than just a chaotic mess. That's an achievement, but it's short of explanation. Explanation will require genuine explanation. Invariably, from this point of view, requires a demonstration of learnability, demonstration of evolvability. And again, that is an austere requirement, but any device that's proposed to account for an aspect of language has to face that as an ultimate challenge. Well, the first proposals going back to the 50s, as all of you know, to deal with this developed two kinds of devices. One, phrase structure grammars for compositionality, another transformational grammars for the ubiquitous property of displacement in language, interpretation of an expression both where it's heard and also somewhere else where it's silent, typically. Both of these systems were far too complex to even approach the goal of genuine explanation. The general assumption at the time was that compositionality is a kind of natural and expected property of language, but dislocation, though ubiquitous, is some strange imperfection that of human language, not to be expected, somehow to be explained away. Now that's a view that's still very widely held in current literature, but I think actually the opposite is true. Recent work suggests that the most primitive operation, the one that most fully meets the conditions of evolvability and learnability, is, strangely enough, displacement. I'll come back to that later on. Compositionality is a more complex operation, even though the two can be unified in an important way. These are topics that began to be understood as the so-called minimalist program was pursued. Well, going back to the earlier period, by the 1960s, it was recognized that phrase structure grammars are completely unacceptable. They just have the wrong properties entirely. For one thing, phrase structure grammars conflate properties that are quite distinct, like hierarchy, linear order, and projection, which are very different properties. They're all put together in a phrase structure grammar. But beyond that, phrase structure grammars simply permit too many options. Like there's nothing in the theory of phrase structure grammar that prevents rules like VP, arrow, N, CP, let's say. It's a fine phrase structure rule. In fact, there's huge numbers of possible phrase structure rules which linguists just avoid because they make no sense. But that's no good. The theory has to tell you what does make sense, what you can't avoid. Anyway, by the 60s, at least in the tradition that I'm discussing, the phrase structure grammars were essentially eliminated. Any use of a phrase structure grammar is at best a very weak descriptive device. They were replaced by X-bar theory. X-bar theory had a number of consequences which were not really appreciated at the time. So, but think back, X-bar theory, of course, avoids linear order. There's no linear order in an X-bar theory. That forces you to move to a principles and parameters approach. There's no choice. So if you take, say, English and Japanese, roughly mirror images in linear order, they have essentially the same X-bar theory, but some parameter that tells you which way you are going to order the two. So it should have been realized right away that X-bar theory excludes the possibility of rule-based systems, at least for compositionality, and requires a move to what later was called the principles and parameters approach. There's really no alternative. Also, X-bar theory was a step, because of this property, towards a much more significant, far-reaching conclusion about language architecture. That became clearer in the work in the minimalist programs, which I'll return in a moment. Well, there was also a serious inadequacy of X-bar theory, which was not recognized at the time, not until a few years ago, in fact. X-bar theory cannot handle exocentric constructions, which abound. So take, say, just plain subject predicate, however you deal with it, say, Sportician-Koopman's predicate internal subject hypothesis. There's two objects, a nominal phrase and a verbal phrase, which have to be constructed separately and independently, and then put together, and they do not fit into an X-bar theoretic framework. And this is all over the place. In fact, every case of movement of internal merge is a case that yields an exocentric construction. Now, if you look at the literature from the 60s right through to today, many artifices were developed to try to sort of get around this problem, giving what one knew to be the plausible example, but with no reason to do it. And that, of course, is entirely unacceptable. So there's something very seriously wrong about X-bar theory. By the 1990s, it seemed to the number of us that enough had been learned about language, particularly with the huge explosion of inquiry that took place in the 1980s after the principles and parameters approach had been more or less formulated with some clarity, leading to a very productive research. And quite a lot was learned, and it seemed that it might be possible to try to confront directly for the first time the task of constructing genuine explanations. An explanation based on properties that would meet the twin conditions of learnability, evolvability, which seem conflicting if you think about them. The problem with learnability requires that the system be rich enough to account for the transition from impoverished data to rich knowledge. On the other hand, it must be simple enough so that it could possibly have evolved. By the 90s, it seemed possible to begin to reconcile these apparently conflicting conditions. Well, pursuing that program, what you do is to seek the simplest computational operation and ask how much can be explained on the basis of the simplest operation which must exist, and other factors that enter into the attainment of the mature state of the I language. The other factors are, of course, external data and general, what we may regard as natural laws, other properties, sometimes called third factor properties. Typically, that would be for a computational system like. Did I do something again? Sorry. I'm the magician behind the curtain.
It's okay, you can
the obvious conditions would be conditions of computational efficiency for a computational system like language. So how much can be explained in these terms? That's essentially the minimalist program. Notice that in this, to the extent that you can do this, you satisfy the learnability and evolvability conditions. The learnability condition, because nothing is learned. The simplest computational operation simply must exist as an innate property. Can't avoid that. So nothing's learned. Now, the evolvability problem is also overcome because the basic property does exist. It's just a fact. And it's clear that some operation or set of operations must have evolved to deal with it. And we would naturally expect that nature would at least pick the simplest possible operation. So the fact that the simplest possible operation evolved is not in question. Had to. Otherwise, we don't have the facts that exist. So there's no learnability or evolvability problem. The innate property might very well be triggered by external events, but that's typical of innate structures, quite generally biological traits. So that does leave questions like how the elementary operation is implemented in the brain. And there's interesting research on this. Best study I know at the moment is Angela Friederici's recent book on the state of the art in neurolinguistics. Very interesting ideas. Well, what's the simplest computational operation? there's one computational operation so simple it must exist in any computational process. That's simply the operation of taking two entities already constructed, forming a new entity from them, and in the simplest case, not modifying either of them or not adding any new structure. That is simply the operation of binary set formation. It's what's called merge in the current literature. And that meets the dual conditions of learnability and evolvability. So anything you can account for in terms of merge is a genuine explanation. Well, there seem to me to have been fairly substantial achievements in this. One achievement is simply the fact that you can unify compositionality and dislocation. These, in fact, are the two subcases of binary set formation. You put two objects together, either they're separate from one another, that's compositionality, or one is inside the other, and you tack it on, that's dislocation. There's a universal property of language that when you do dislocation, internal merge, the one of the copies, typically the lower one, is either totally deleted or is left with some small residue in some languages, but is not fully expressed. And that follows at once from third factor considerations, limiting computation. Limiting would be, it's a tremendous burden on the internal computation and even the externalization, the control the motor apparatus and so on to repeat every copy. So what the mind does is to restrict as greatly as possible the computational operations, keep the limited one. Now that has interesting consequences. It leads to parsing problems, as everyone knows. Anyone who's worked on parsing programs knows that one of the hardest problems is what are called filler gap problems, trying to find how to fill the gap, where is the gap that's associated with what you hear at the beginning of the sentence. But most of that could be overcome if you simply copied it, if you simply articulated everything. But it seems that language, it just doesn't care about efficiency of parsing or about efficiency of communication altogether. It only cares about constructing the optimal system, the most elegant, internal, simplest system. There's many examples of that. A lot of consequences if you think about it. Well, that's one of this indicates that far from being an imperfection, the dislocation is expected in an elementary computational system. In order to bar it, you'd have to have some stipulation. And furthermore, if you think about it, of the two options, compositionality and dislocation, the dislocation is the simpler one. For one reason, it requires no search, almost no search. You just have to search the object that you're looking at. For compositionality, you have to search the entire lexicon, huge search, plus anything that's already been constructed to decide whether to put those two things together. So it's the simplest operation, it's the most primitive. And there are also other reasons for thinking that it is the most primitive. So for example, there was an interesting study by Noam Chomsky some years ago, founder of artificial intelligence. He and one of his students simply experimented with the simplest computational systems, technically the simplest Turing machines, the ones with the smallest number of states and the smallest number of symbols, and just asked what happens if you let these things run free. And what happened was that most of them simply crash. They either get into infinite loops or they terminate. The ones that didn't crash had an interesting property. They yielded the successor function. Now, take a look at internal merge. It is the success, in the simplest case, in fact, is the successor function. With a language of a lexicon of one element, internal merge yields a successor function. And Minsky suggested plausibly that nature was likely to have looked for the simplest thing that works, which would in fact be, we now be able to say, internal merge. But there are other reasons too. If you look at other organisms, even down to the level of insects, they have counters. Like an ant can count the number of steps that it took going to a certain food source and then back. When you build up counters, you get pretty close to the successor function. So if you think about it in evolutionary terms, there's a basis for moving from simple counting systems up to the point where you somehow, with some small change in the wiring of the brain, you go all the way to the simplest operation, the successor function, essentially internal merge. But the point that more generally, both forms of merge are automatically available once you pick the simplest operation. I think this is a new kind of result, and I think a rather significant one. It's one of the rare examples of genuine explanation of a fundamental property of language. Well, notice that, of course, it's not just dislocation, it's dislocation plus reconstruction. So it automatically yields for the mind, the internal expressions, which in fact are the basis for the full interpretation under reconstruction. It's automatic, has many interpretive consequences. Just to take one familiar example, take the sentence, it's his mother that every boy admires. Compare it with it's his mother that admires every boy. Obvious difference in quantifier variable relation. To look at the reasons, it's perfectly obvious, because what's reaching the mind, though not the ear, is the full system without the externalization that deletes the copy, and that yields the interpretation. There are, of course, much more complex examples. Just to take one to illustrate, compare which of his pictures did the museum think that every artist likes best. Answer is first. Which of his pictures convinced the museum that every artist likes flowers? No relation between every and his. And you get very complex examples. What reaches the mind yields the interpretation instantly. What reaches the ear has problems. You have to sort of do a lot of decoding to try to figure out where the gap is. These are genuine explanations of non-trivial properties. Actually, the most interesting case, which has been extensively discussed in literature in a very odd way, is the property called structure dependence. There's a very strange property of language, which was noticed back in the 50s when the study of these topics began in a serious way. Why is it the case that in all languages, in all constructions, the linear order is ignored, and what's used is only hierarchical structure? It's very strange for two reasons. For one thing, everything that you hear is linear order, but everything you hear is ignored. You never hear structure. That's abstract. Now, the other reason is that computations on linear order superficially look far simpler. It's very easy to write programs that say, pick the third word, pick the first auxiliary and move it to the front. It's trivial. Now, what language universally does is say, forget about the simple computations, use one that keeps to linear, to hierarchical structure. Now, the standard example that's discussed in this is aux raising. It's So you're all like, why? Yeah, if you say, can animals that fly swim? Why does it mean can swim, not can fly? In some ways, that was a bad example to use because it creates the illusion that there might be a way to learn this by looking at a lot of data. It's an illusion. But there's an immense literature in cognitive science with papers still coming out. One is in press, coming out in language soon, trying to show that with a rich enough system, say recurrent neural networks and 10 billion examples, it would be possible to learn this. It's totally, all of this literature is totally irrelevant. It's been very hard to make this point, but it's worth thinking about. For one thing, all the methods failed, but that doesn't matter. Suppose they succeeded, it would be of no interest whatsoever, none. Because if they succeeded, they are not addressing the question that is the right question. Why is this chosen in all languages and all constructions? Why doesn't any language use, say, linear order? Much simpler, and that's what you hear. So even if you could get a method, you know, looking at many training examples, a huge supercomputer and so on, that gave you something like what infants know, it would tell you nothing. Because the question is, why does it work this way? Why not some other way? Another strange property of this literature is that it's doing something that is never done in the sciences. It's trying to find a complex way to refute the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is that the simplest possible operation yields structure dependence, which is a fact. If the only operation is merge, automatically it yields structure dependence. So the problem is solved by the simplest possible way with a genuine explanation. So we have to ask ourselves, what curious pathology is it in the field of computational cognitive science that leads people over and over again, with more papers coming out still, to try to find a way to refute the null hypothesis, and meanwhile not addressing the single question that is raised, namely, why is it always this way? Why is it never any other way? It's an interesting, and of course, quite beyond that, there are cases in the literature which the example of what Hawke's raising is misleading, because it does suggest you might be able to find a way to learn from data. There are other perfectly standard cases where it's just impossible. So take, say, construal rules. Carefully, the guy who fixed the car packed up his tools. Why does carefully go with packed his tools, not with fix the car? Any number of cases like that. There's zero data for the child. So no amount, even the richest R&R system isn't, no matter how much training, it's not going to find anything. So it's a very strange phenomenon worth thinking about. But the fact of the matter is that structure dependence, like dislocation and reconstruction, are very curious properties. They're universal from language. We do have optimal solutions for them. In the case of structure dependence, it goes even beyond. As many of you know, there's no neurolinguistic evidence. This work that Massimo actually suggested to a group in Milan that studied cases where subjects were presented with nonsense languages, one set was languages, real language, based on the structure of real languages, which they didn't know. The other used rules that violate universal grammar, like, for example, using linear order for, say, negation. And what was found was that in the case where the nonsense language was modeled on a real language using structure dependence, you get activity in the normal language areas of the brain, Broca's area. In the case of the nonsense language, using things like linear order, you get diffuse activity in the brain, meaning it's basically being treated as a puzzle. This was based on a psycholinguistic experiment, which was Massimo's reason for suggesting it, studied by Neil Smith and Ianthe Timpley, who, as many of you know, have been working for some years with a subject. Chris, that's the guy who has extreme cognitive disability. He can't figure out anything, but has remarkable linguistic ability, picks up languages like a sponge. And Smith and Timpley noticed that when they tried some similar experiment with Chris, he could do nothing at all with the simple language that used linear order, but the nonsense language based on a real language he could learn immediately. It was the basis for the suggestion that the neurolinguistic study go on. There's also by now evidence from child acquisition. So by now studies have shown that infants as young as 30 months old already have mastered the principle of structure dependence. Ignore order, use structure. Almost no data available. So in fact, we have converging evidence from all sources that tell us that the null hypothesis appears to be correct, which makes it even stranger that there are efforts to try to show that there's some other way to achieve what follows from almost no assumptions. Well, that does raise the question why linear order exists at all if it's not used in the computations that deal with the core of the Galilean challenge. They construct the basic property, the construction of an infinite number of expressions that capture the thoughts that we have that we can give linguistic interpretation to. Well, the answer to that's pretty obvious. The linear order exists because that's what the articulatory system requires. But of course, the articulatory system has absolutely nothing to do with language. That was, the sensory motor systems were in place probably millions of years, certainly hundreds of thousands of years before language ever developed, and they've never changed. Only the most marginal changes have been speculated about changes in the articulatory system. So when we study linear order, we're in fact studying a system which has nothing to do with language. Or to be more, to put it differently, we're studying an amalgam of two systems. One of them, language, which yields the expression of thought. Another, a separate system, the sensory motor system, has nothing to do with language. It's an amalgam of two systems. That's the externalization problem, to try to relate two independent systems. Also the processing problem, to relate two independent systems. Notice in the case of sign, which as we now know is essentially equivalent to spoken language, any interesting aspect, there's a different dimension. Sign language can use the dimensionality of visual space. So it doesn't strictly keep the linear order. It uses points in space, even simultaneous actions like facial gestures combined with signs. And that's not possible so it has a kind of a multidimensionality that spoken language doesn't have and doesn't strictly keep the linear order. Now, if you think about it, it's very natural to expect that when you're studying the amalgam of two independent systems, asking how two independent systems can be related, it's going to be pretty complex. But also there are many different ways to solve the problem of how to relate them. Also, you'd expect it to be able to change pretty quickly from generation to generation. And it seems increasingly plausible that the apparent variety and complexity and mutability of human languages probably is located in the externalization system, meaning it's not, strictly speaking, language. Could turn out, and one goal to try to see how closely we can approach, could turn out that the core I language, the part that's meeting the basic property, constructing an infinite array of structured expressions, giving them a semantic interpretation, could be that this is uniform among people. Actually, notice that that's pretty much presupposed by the work in formal semantics. Nobody suggests that there are parameters for, say, a neo-Davidsonian event calculus. Either it works or it doesn't work. And it's just tacitly assumed that it's universal, which makes good sense because there's almost no evidence for it. And the child has actually no evidence about how these things work. So it's sort of got to be universal. And it's very likely true for most of syntax as well, maybe all of it. So one potential goal to think about trying to approach is to show that core I language is just fixed, and that the variety of mutability, complexity is in the trying to put together two different systems that have nothing to do with one another. A kind of an odd conclusion follows if this is correct, namely that virtually all the work on language in the last 2,500 years isn't about language. It's about a connection between language and some other system. Also follows that the word for language is misleading. What is called language in various languages is usually something about the mouth, the tongue, the lips, something like that, which is really about the sensory motor system, one of the sensory motor systems. So I think kind of a rethinking of the nature of the field begins to emerge when you think seriously about the Galilean challenge. Well, it's, I really, just getting to the point of current research, it is possible to show that the fundamental operation merge has a number of problems. One is it isn't sufficient. You need other operations. It's quite easy to show that. We would like to be able to show that these other operations are essentially consequences of the need to satisfy conditions of computational efficiency. And there's interesting work in that direction. It's a large, intriguing task to establish that conclusion firmly, but there are steps in that direction. And also there are interesting questions when you look at merge itself, at the fundamental operation. It turns out that it was defined much too loosely. It was defined in such a way that many subcases can be imagined, which appear to give interesting descriptions of many phenomena, like across-the-board movement and so on. But these operations, these extensions, are fundamentally illegitimate, as you can see when you begin to explore them closely and look at their consequences. And that's another direction in which current research is going. It's, of course, an enormous task, very challenging task, to try to show that the tremendous array of evidence about the languages of widely varying typology can, all of this has exploded since the study of odd languages began a couple of days ago, posing questions that certainly couldn't have been formulated, it couldn't even been imagined some years ago. So try to, like the ones being discussed in this conference, for example, so to try to show that those can all be given genuine explanations, that's quite a serious challenge and makes the field a very interesting one in the years to come.